Welcome to the Nickolas Natali Show. Today I have a solo episode for you, curated specifically for you, crafted in the lab, and handmade for you to enjoy. So open up those ears and let's dive in. I don't go on Facebook that often. That's just the truth of it. I don't. It's not my social media platform of choice these days, but I did the other day. And by the other day, I mean maybe 2 days ago. I popped it open, and the first post that I saw was of someone that I don't quite know, an acquaintance of sorts. Like I know them from knowing someone else in a way, like we ran in similar groups, but I've never met them in person to my knowledge. And their post was essentially a goodbye post. Like, I'm sorry that I am bad, I'm a bad person, sorry that I am not enough. I love my family. If this is the last post you hear from me, I hope that we ended things on good terms. Like that, it was gonna be the end. And there were probably 200 comments on that post. 200 comments from people that were close to them and also acquaintances of people saying, hey, I know we've never met, but I would hop on a phone call with you right now. Here's a number to call if you need someone to talk to. You are loved. All of these things insinuating that their life has value. And so I want to share some of my personal testimony in that realm, in the hope that it resonates with somebody going through something difficult like that. I think not that it's taboo in any sense. I think, if anything, mental health and depression and anxiety is talked about more now than it has in the past. However, not to the degree of ensuring that lives are protected. Protected might not be the right word there. I'm not having the best choice of words, but essentially not in the idea of I go through this thing and this is something I live with, but something that is consuming me to the point where I will hide this and mask this and will not bring this forward because I feel so crippled by it. That doesn't get talked about all that often, so let's do that. There was a phase in my life where I was that. I was suicidal. I had suicidal ideation for sure. I had terrible self-talk. I probably said the meanest things to myself than I've ever said to anybody. I don't know how mean I've ever been to anybody else, but I've certainly been mean to myself. And there was a time where I truthfully just hated myself. And I think there was a few things that stemmed, a few foundational things that were prompting some of these, and I'll go through a few of them. One of them was my faith at the time. I had encountered somebody who was a proclaiming Christian, and they were a pastor, and I just saw them living very hypocritically. And before we get into all Christians are hypocrites, and in some ways that's true. I think we're all falling short of the glory of God and what God has for us and being able to be obedient. But I had a pastor that was just mean to me or very at a poor rapport with for reasons that I couldn't really understand, at least at the time or the age that I was. And that caused me to think that Christianity, if this is what Christianity is meant to look like, I want no part of it. And up until that point, I was a strong believer, I'd say. I held the faith, but in that phase, I was like, this is not it. So I didn't want to completely abandon my faith, but I also wasn't willing to go completely on the other side. There's temporary satisfaction in, let's say, finding immediate pleasure. Could be drugs, could be sex, could be any sort of these innate temptations that we view as things that we may want to stay away from, especially doing these things beyond moderation. Those are all things that can provide temporary satisfaction or temporary joy. And then on the other side, there's eternal joy. There's serving the Lord, being obedient to what God has commanded us to be and do. And I lived right on the fence of these two. I didn't want to commit to either side. So being on the fence is a tough place to be because it hurts. You ever sat with both of your legs on either side of a fence? It's uncomfortable. And that's where I lived. It was this gray area that caused for a lot of lack of purpose for my life. What I thought was true was now being tested against. This caused a lot of internal turmoil, and there was a conversation that I had with one of my friends that has really been ingrained in my head for a long time. I was getting to the point where I was like, I'm going to do it. Like, this is too much for me. I would rather be out than be in. And so I had this conversation with my friend where I told him, I was like, this is it. You know, there's nothing else. Like, I'm going to find a way to do this. And seeing his response to that gave me pause. Like, I remember, I don't want to paint the picture too vividly, but I just remember seeing how much he cared, but I definitely wasn't registering it. Like, I didn't feel anything. I was so engulfed at the time, but I still see like the words he said and his facial expressions and his posture, how much he cared about me. But I wasn't completely deterred from the idea just from that one instance. And then later on, I was still deep in the cave. I went to this is going to sound pretty ironic, but I went to this discipleship camp, and I felt like I was not hearing from God in the slightest, that God had abandoned me. And I was also reading the book Ecclesiastes at the time, and from what I remember, it talked about how there was nothing purposeful underneath the sun, that life had no purpose. I didn't finish the book. Ultimately, if you finish the book, it's like God provides the purpose. You know, God is the purpose there. But I only got to the part where it was like, there is no purpose. And I was like, even your book says it, you know, like I'm so done. But when I went to this discipleship camp, I didn't have very high expectations of what I was going to experience. All I knew was that I, at the very least, wanted to see a deer. Now, this wasn't the most forest-esque type of place for a discipleship camp for a young man to go to. Like, it certainly wasn't commercial, but it certainly wasn't not in the wilderness. It had potential to happen, but it was pretty unlikely to see any wildlife like that, at least from my perspective as an adult looking back. I don't think it was a very common occurrence, but maybe it was, you know. I'm happy to say maybe it was. And so I think it's like a 6-day camp. Day 1, just could care less. 2, 3, 4. And it might have been the second to last night or the last night. Either way, it must have been. I ended up meeting up with a youth pastor, different person than at the beginning of the story. A different person, and we were just chatting, and we were almost in the center of the camp, more or less. Like, it was the place where they give the talks, the big speeches, and we're sitting on a log bench, and I remember this deer. I know, you knew it was coming. I remember this deer walking up to us, and it probably got maybe 15 feet away from us. And this deer was not afraid, it was not worried, it was by itself. And it was staring at me. And I remember the youth pastor that I was with looked at me and was like, I wonder why that's here. And I just remember thinking, I know why that deer is here. And that deer did not take its eyes off of me. And we ended up getting up to leave, and it followed us for a good amount of time until we got to the top of the hill where we're at. And I remember thinking in my head, like, God, okay, I get it. Like, I understand you're real. Like, you've submitted that point. It was fascinating. And it's an experience that I still hold on to, that God pursued me in that way. And my life didn't turn around immediately, obviously. I mean, thankfully, I'm here now. Shout out. And you're here too if you're listening to it, so shout out to you. But I did ended up recommitting my life to Christ probably a year later. And I wanted to make this episode in particular because you are loved. Your life has value. And I'm a firm believer that there is more people in our life that care about us than we realize. So, if you're going through this battle, here is what I'd like to offer you. A great antidepressant is exercise. Get out there, move your body, get some sunlight. Next, get in community as often as possible. There's a huge temptation to isolate ourselves and to mask things, to hide things. I was really good at putting on a face. Actually, there's a part of the story that I've never told before. My depression got so bad at one point that it caused me physical pain. There was a point where I couldn't walk. Like my back, I was hunched over so much, I was bedridden. I went to a nerve doctor, and this is still the most painful experience that I have ever had, despite having broken a near compound break on both of the bones of my arm at once, snapping it, doing a muscle up, story for another day. But I remember them stabbing me with a giant needle in my lower back and in the crux of my foot and making me flex into it just to see if my nerves were good. And the cartilage in my vertebrae had grinded down. I was a young person at the time. I had no right for something like this to be happening. And not being able to walk. That's how powerful our mind is. And I hope that we can inverse that too to see how powerful it can be in the positive. But that's how powerful it can be in the negative if you allow it to be. Your mind can deteriorate your own body, which is wild. So get exercise, get in community, know you're loved. This might not be an easy road, but it's not one you cannot withstand. I hope this helps. I hope this resonates with somebody. See you next Friday. Bye.